Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. I'm Adam, and today I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Julia. We're so happy that you decided to spend your valuable time with us. Whether you're listening from your home, your office, your school, or even from a park bench somewhere in the world, thank you for tuning in. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you for a small favor. Please take a quick moment to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. We love reading your messages, and it helps us feel how connected our English learning family truly is.
Yes, absolutely. Every comment from you inspires us to make better and more helpful content for English learners everywhere. So don't be shy. Introduce yourself below and tell us about your city or your country. You can also share your opinions about today's topic because this podcast is not only about learning English, but also about understanding ideas that shape our modern world. We want you to join the discussion, to think, and to use English to express your thoughts.
Today we're exploring a very interesting and powerful story from New York City. It's about a man named Zohran Mamdani and about a movement he's leading that is challenging the traditional way politics has worked for many years. The title of today's episode is Zohran Mamdani's Movement: How One Man is Challenging Power in NYC. Now, this isn't just another political story. It's about courage, fairness, and community. It's about how one person can stand up for people who often feel unheard, and how ideas can turn into real change.
That's right, Adam. Many people think that politics is only for rich or famous people. But this story shows that even someone with a simple background can become a voice for their community. Zohran Mamdani's journey reminds us that leadership can grow from ordinary neighborhoods, from people who care deeply about others, and from those who want to make their city a better place. And this story connects beautifully with our goal here at the English Globe: to learn English through real stories that matter.
Exactly, Julia. This is not only a political topic, it's also a learning opportunity. By following this story, our listeners will learn many useful English words and expressions related to social issues, leadership, and community life. They'll hear terms like grassroots movement, affordable housing, and representation. And don't worry, we'll explain everything clearly so that even if you are a beginner English learner, you can understand and enjoy every part of it.
This episode is educational, respectful, and completely in line with YouTube's community and monetization guidelines. Our aim is not to promote any political party or ideology. Instead, we focus on education, language practice, and critical thinking. We want you to gain both knowledge and vocabulary at the same time. We believe that when you learn English through stories that have meaning, your progress becomes faster, deeper, and more enjoyable.
And what makes this topic so important is that it connects with global themes: fairness, justice, and equality. Even if you don't live in the United States, you probably see similar issues where you live: high rent prices, expensive transportation, and unequal opportunities. When someone like Zohran Mamdani stands up to change those things in his community, it inspires people in other countries too. That's why this story isn't just local. It's universal.
Exactly, Adam. English learners can use this story as a chance to learn how people around the world use language to express change, leadership, and hope. You'll notice how politicians and activists choose words carefully to connect with people's emotions and everyday struggles. So as we move through this story, listen closely not only to the information, but also to the language. Try to repeat important words, write them down, and maybe use them later in your own sentences.
That's a great idea, Julia. Remember, dear listeners, language learning is more effective when you connect it with real-world ideas. When you hear new words in meaningful situations, you remember them longer. For example, hearing how Mamdani talks about community power or public service will help you understand these phrases naturally, without memorizing them from a textbook. That's why we love using current topics like this one. It makes English feel alive and useful.
And one of the best things about the English Globe community is that our listeners don't just study English, they live it. You all come from many backgrounds: students, teachers, professionals, travelers, and dreamers. When we share stories about people making a difference, it reminds us that learning English opens doors to understanding global stories like this one. It's a bridge that connects ideas from New York to Nairobi, from London to Lahore, and from Kabul to Kuala Lumpur.
Beautifully said, Julia. And I also want to remind everyone that this is a safe learning space. We always make sure our discussions are informative, balanced, and positive. Our goal is to help you grow as English learners and as global citizens. So as we begin today's journey, keep an open mind. Think about what leadership means to you. Ask yourself, what would I do if I had the power to improve my community? These questions make your English practice more meaningful.
Yes, that's the heart of today's topic. We're not just learning about Zohran Mamdani's life, we're learning what his story teaches us about courage, responsibility, and the power of ideas. You'll hear how his movement started, what challenges he faced, and how people around him began to believe in change. You'll also learn how language can be a tool for connection and hope, just like we use it here in this podcast.
So once again, dear listeners, if you haven't already, please click like, subscribe to the English Globe, and share this podcast with your friends who are learning English too. The more people join, the stronger our learning community becomes. And don't forget to comment below. Tell us where you're listening from and what topics you'd like us to cover next time. Your feedback helps us make every episode better for you.
Now let's get ready to dive into the world of New York City politics, where one man, Zohran Mamdani, is challenging old systems and inspiring new ideas. This story is not only about power, it's about purpose. It's about how language, action, and belief can shape the future of a city and even the mindset of a generation. And through it, you will not only understand English better, but also the world around you.
That's the perfect way to begin, Julia. So, stay with us as we start exploring who Zohran Mamdani is, where he comes from, and how his background shaped his vision for change. This is the English Globe, and you're listening to a story that combines language learning, global awareness, and human inspiration all in one. Let's begin our journey together. So, Julia, before we talk about Zohran Mamdani's movement and his ideas, I think it's important for our listeners to first understand who he really is. Every movement begins with a person, and behind every leader there's a story of where they come from, what experiences shaped them, and what inspired them to take action. Zohran Mamdani's background is not just interesting, it's a story of migration, identity, and hope that many people around the world can relate to.
Exactly, Adam. Zohran Mamdani was born in Uganda, a country in East Africa, but his family's story didn't stop there. His parents later moved to the United States, and he grew up in New York City. Imagine that. A child who experienced life between two worlds, one filled with the stories of his African roots, and another full of the busy energy of an American city. That mix of cultures and experiences helped shape the person he would become later in life.
Yes, and growing up in New York City is a lesson in diversity by itself. It's a place where you hear dozens of languages every day, where people from every corner of the planet live side by side. For a young Zohran, that environment was like a living classroom. He learned about differences, but he also learned about what connects people, their struggles, their dreams, and their desire for fairness. These early lessons would later inspire his political journey.
Zohran's parents also played an important role in shaping his worldview. His father, Mahmoud Mamdani, is a respected scholar and author who writes about history, politics, and justice. His mother, Mira Nair, is a world-famous film director known for movies that explore identity and culture. So you can imagine that growing up in such a family encouraged curiosity, creativity, and critical thinking. From a young age, Zohran learned that ideas can change the way people see the world.
That's very true, Julia. But what's interesting about Zohran Mamdani is that even though his family was successful, he didn't choose an easy path. He could have worked in a comfortable job, but instead he decided to work directly with people in his community. He wanted to understand their daily problems, like high rent, unfair wages, and expensive transportation. That choice showed something important about his character. He didn't just want to talk about change, he wanted to make it happen.
Before entering politics, Zohran studied philosophy at the University of Chicago. That's where he learned to think deeply about society, ethics, and human behavior. Philosophy teaches people how to ask important questions like, what is justice? And what kind of world should we build together? For him, those questions didn't stay in books. They became part of his real life. After college, he returned to New York, where he started working as a housing counselor, helping tenants who were struggling to pay rent or facing eviction.
And that experience really changed him. Working with families who were about to lose their homes gave him a new understanding of inequality. He saw how difficult it was for ordinary people to live in one of the richest cities in the world. Some people were working full-time but still couldn't afford rent. Some had to choose between paying for food or electricity. These stories made him realize that big systems like housing, transport, and healthcare weren't designed for everyone equally.
Yes, and it was during those years that he decided to run for public office. He didn't come from a powerful political family or have a lot of money behind him. Instead, he started small, knocking on doors, meeting local residents, and listening to what they had to say. He campaigned in the neighborhood of Astoria in Queens, New York. It's a very diverse area where people speak many languages and come from many backgrounds. He ran for the New York State Assembly, a part of the state's government that makes laws.
In 2020, Zohran Mamdani was elected to represent the 36th district in Queens. That was a huge moment for him and for his supporters because it showed that a grassroots campaign, one built on real people and real stories, can actually win. Many political experts were surprised, but for the community it felt like their voices were finally being heard. His victory speech was not about personal success. It was about the people who believed that change was possible if they worked together.
And for English learners, this story is a great example of how to describe someone's background in detail. You can learn phrases like, he was born in, he grew up in, and he worked as. These are simple but powerful sentences that help you talk about people's lives. You can even practice making your own sentences by describing your background, your family, or your hometown. In this way, you not only learn English grammar, but also build confidence to speak about yourself.
That's a really useful tip, Julia. Language is most effective when we connect it to real human stories. And Zohran's life teaches us that understanding people's backgrounds helps us understand their motivations. He didn't just wake up one day and decide to challenge power. His beliefs came from years of watching inequality and wanting to fix it. When he saw how many people were struggling to afford basic needs, he realized that fairness wasn't automatic. It had to be fought for.
You're absolutely right, Adam. And that's what makes his story inspiring for learners everywhere. It shows that leadership doesn't depend on age, race, or wealth. It depends on empathy and action. Zohran Mamdani became a symbol of a new kind of politics, one that focuses on people first. He proved that even in a huge city like New York, where power often stays in the hands of a few, ordinary citizens can make their voices heard if they stand together.
And from a language perspective, it's also interesting how he communicates. His speeches are clear and emotional, filled with simple but strong words. He talks about dignity, justice, housing, and hope. For English learners, this kind of language is a great model because it shows that you don't need complex vocabulary to speak powerfully. The best communication often comes from using simple words to express big ideas.
That's a wonderful observation, Adam. And as we continue in the next part of this podcast, we'll explore the challenges that pushed Zohran Mamdani to start his movement. We'll talk about the problems in New York City that motivated him to take action. things like the housing crisis, transportation costs, and inequality. By understanding the problems, we can better understand his solutions. But more importantly, our listeners will also learn new vocabulary and expressions related to everyday life and society.
Exactly. So, dear listeners, before we move forward, take a moment to reflect on what you learned in this section. Think about your own background and what motivates you to make positive changes. And if you found this part inspiring, please don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the English Globe. Tell us in the comments what part of Zohran Mamdani's story you connected with the most. We always enjoy reading your insights and opinions.
That's the beauty of learning through stories. It connects us beyond language. So, get ready as we move into the next chapter of our podcast, where we'll dive into the big challenges of New York City and see why Zohran Mamdani believes those issues are at the heart of his movement for change. Stay with us as we continue this journey of English learning and real-world understanding here on the English Globe. When we talk about Zohran Mamdani's movement, we cannot ignore one of the biggest issues in New York City: affordability. Many New Yorkers face serious problems when it comes to housing, rent, public transportation, and even groceries. The cost of living in this city has gone up so much that many working families find it hard to keep up. Imagine a person working 2 jobs and still struggling to pay rent or buy food. This is the reality for thousands of people in the city that never sleeps. The question is not only how people live, but how they survive.
That's a really important point, Julia. I think a lot of our listeners who are learning English might not fully understand some of the words you mentioned. Could you please explain what affordability means in simple terms?
Of course, Adam. The word affordability comes from the verb afford, which means to have enough money to pay for something. When we say affordability, we're talking about how easy or difficult it is to pay for basic needs like rent, food, or transportation. For example, if someone says, New York City has an affordability crisis, it means that prices are too high and people cannot afford to live comfortably. It's a word often used in discussions about housing and cost of living.
That makes perfect sense. And I've also heard the term rent freeze in discussions about New York housing. What does that mean, Julia?
Good question, Adam. A rent freeze is a government rule or policy that stops landlords from increasing the rent for a certain period of time. It's like pressing the pause button on rent prices. The idea is to protect tenants, people who rent homes, from paying more than they can afford. For example, if your rent is $1,200 per month and the city announces a rent freeze, the landlord cannot raise it to $1,300 or $1,400 for that year. It's a temporary relief for people who are struggling with rising costs.
That's a great explanation. And you also mentioned public transit. Many learners might not be familiar with that term either. Could you explain it in simple English?
Yes, of course. Public transit means transportation that is available for everyone and usually run by the government. It includes buses, subways, and trains that people use to travel around the city. In New York, the subway system is one of the largest in the world. But here's the problem. Fares, or ticket prices, keep increasing, and that makes it harder for low-income workers to travel every day. Some people spend more than $100 each month just on subway rides. When you add that to rent and groceries, you can see how expensive city life becomes.
That's really eye-opening, Julia. It shows how interconnected these problems are. When housing costs go up and transport costs rise too, people are left with less money for food or education. It's a cycle that traps many families. And this is exactly what Zohran Mamdani's movement focuses on, finding ways to make life more affordable for everyone, not just the wealthy few.
Exactly, Adam. And that's what makes this topic so important for English learners to understand. When we learn words like affordability, rent freeze, and public transit, we're not just studying vocabulary, we're learning how to talk about real-life issues that affect millions of people. These are the kinds of words you'll often hear in the news, in discussions about cities, and even in political speeches. Understanding them helps you follow global conversations more confidently.
Well said, Julia. And it's amazing how language and life are always connected. When learners study topics like this, they don't just improve their English, they also develop awareness of the world around them. That's the beauty of learning through stories and real-world examples.
Now that we've talked about New York's affordability crisis, let's look at the ideas and policies that Zohran Mamdani has been promoting to help ordinary people. His platform is built around one simple idea: making New York City fairer for everyone. He believes that no one should have to choose between paying rent and buying food, and that the government should take real action to support working families. His proposals are clear, practical, and focused on people, not corporations. Some of his key policies include a rent freeze, affordable housing, free city buses, city-run grocery stores, a higher minimum wage, and fairer taxes on the rich. Each of these ideas aims to reduce the daily burden on citizens and make life more balanced.
That sounds like a really interesting plan, Julia. Let's take each one slowly so our listeners can understand both the policy and the English vocabulary behind it. You mentioned rent freeze earlier, but could you remind our learners again what that means in simple words?
Of course, Adam. A rent freeze means that landlords are not allowed to increase the price of rent for a certain period of time. Imagine you pay $1,000 per month for your apartment. If the city decides to freeze rent for a year, your landlord cannot raise your rent to $1,100 or $1,200 during that time. It's a way to protect tenants, people who rent homes, from rising housing costs. This policy helps families plan their budgets and feel more secure about their homes.
That's very clear. And the next one is affordable housing. Many learners have heard this phrase, but it can be confusing. What exactly does affordable housing mean?
Good question, Adam. Affordable housing means homes that people with low or middle incomes can afford to live in. In big cities like New York, many apartments are too expensive for teachers, taxi drivers, or small business workers. So the government creates special housing projects or programs where the rent is lower. The goal is to make sure that everyone, not just rich people, can have a safe and decent place to live. In simple words, affordable housing means housing that matches what people earn.
That's a very useful way to put it, Julia. And I think one of the most creative ideas in Mamdani's plan is the free city bus pilot. What does that mean exactly?
Yes, Adam. It's a really interesting idea. A free city bus pilot means testing a program where people can ride buses for free for a certain time or in certain areas. The word pilot here doesn't mean a person who flies a plane. It means a test program or experiment. The city tries the plan first to see if it works. The goal is to make transportation more affordable and encourage people to use public buses instead of cars. It also helps reduce pollution and traffic. For many working people, even saving a few dollars every day on bus fares can make a big difference.
That's great, Julia. I really like how he connects environmental issues with people's daily lives. Now, another proposal you mentioned sounds unusual: city-run grocery stores. What does that mean?
Yes, this one surprises many people, Adam. City-run grocery stores are supermarkets owned and managed by the city government, not by private companies. The idea is to make food prices fair and to ensure that healthy food is available to everyone. In many poor neighborhoods, there are few grocery stores, and prices are high. Some people even live in what we call food deserts, places where it's hard to find fresh fruits and vegetables. So city-run stores would sell food at lower prices, helping families who are struggling with high living costs.
That's a really interesting concept, Julia, and I can see how that could change people's daily lives. Now let's move on to another big one: minimum wage. Would you explain in simple words what minimum wage means?
Absolutely, Adam. Minimum wage is the lowest amount of money that a worker can legally be paid for 1 hour of work. It's a law that protects workers from being underpaid. For example, if the minimum wage in New York is $16 per hour, employers cannot pay someone $12 or $10. they must pay at least $16. Zohran Mamdani wants to raise the minimum wage so that workers can earn enough to cover their basic needs: rent, food, transportation, and healthcare. He believes that if you work full-time, you should be able to live with dignity.
That's a very strong point, Julia. And it's also an important word for our English learners to know because minimum wage is a term used in almost every country. It's part of the basic vocabulary for understanding labor rights and economics. Now, you also mentioned that Mamdani supports taxes on the rich. Can you explain that idea too?
Yes, of course. Taxes on the rich means that people who earn a lot of money or own big companies should pay a higher percentage of taxes than those who earn less. The idea is called progressive taxation. It means that the more you earn, the more you contribute to society. Mamdani believes this system can create fairness because the extra money collected from wealthy people can be used to fund public services, like schools, buses, hospitals, and affordable housing. It's about sharing resources more equally so that everyone benefits, not just the top few percent.
That's very educational, Julia. And it's also a great chance for our listeners to learn words like progressive taxation and public services. Could you give an easy example of public services for them?
Of course, Adam. Public services are services provided by the government for everyone, often paid for through taxes. Examples include public schools, police, hospitals, public libraries, parks, and transportation. These services are not about profit, they're about improving life for all citizens. So, when Mamdani talks about taxing the rich more, he means using that money to strengthen public services that everyone uses.
That's a smart approach. And I like how we're connecting new vocabulary with real-life examples. For English learners, this is a perfect way to expand their vocabulary and understand how these words appear in context.
Exactly, Adam. That's one reason we talk about real people like Zohran Mamdani, because his proposals give us a clear way to learn not only English, but also how ideas work in society. Words like affordable housing, minimum wage, and public transit are not just words in a dictionary. They describe real things that shape people's lives. When learners understand both meaning and context, their English becomes more powerful and natural.
Very true, Julia. Mamdani's platform is not just about fixing problems, it's about giving people hope and a sense of fairness. And through these discussions, our listeners are not only improving their English but also learning about social issues that affect millions around the world.
Yes, Adam. And that's what makes this conversation so important. It's about connecting language learning with awareness, compassion, and understanding. Because when we know how to describe the problems around us, we can start thinking about solutions. And that, after all, is what education and English learning is all about. Now that we've explored Zohran Mamdani's ideas and proposals, let's talk about how his campaign actually works. What makes his movement so unique is not just what he believes in, but how he spreads his message. His team doesn't rely on big advertising companies or expensive consultants. Instead, they focus on grassroots organizing. That means working directly with people in the community. Volunteers knock on doors, make phone calls, and speak to residents in multiple languages to make sure everyone's voice is heard. In a city as diverse as New York, that kind of outreach is powerful. It's personal, human, and real.
That's really interesting, Julia. I think a lot of our listeners might be hearing the word grassroots for the first time. Could you explain what grassroots means in simple English?
Of course, Adam. The word grassroots describes movements or actions that start with regular people, not with big companies or politicians. It comes from the idea that grass grows from the ground up. So when we say a movement is grassroots, we mean it begins with local people who care about their neighborhoods and communities. They organize themselves, talk to others, and work together to create change. For example, when volunteers in Queens start visiting their neighbors to talk about rent or transportation issues, that's grassroots action. It's people-powered politics.
That's a great way to put it, Julia. So, Why is grassroots organizing so important for campaigns like Mamdani's?
It's important because it builds real trust, Adam. When a campaign is built by people from the community, it feels honest and relatable. Voters don't just hear about ideas, they talk about them face to face. Grassroots campaigns also give power to people who are often ignored in politics, like immigrants, low-income families, and young workers. It turns everyday people into leaders, and it uses action verbs like organize, mobilize, and volunteer, words that describe what real democracy looks like.
Those are great words for English learners to know. Organize, mobilize, and volunteer. Could you explain them one by one, Julia?
Sure, Adam. Let's start with organize. The word organize means to plan and arrange something carefully. For example, if you organize a meeting, you decide where and when it will happen and who will join. In politics, organizing means planning events, community talks, or protests. Then we have mobilize. The word mobilize means to prepare and move people to take action. When Mamdani's team mobilizes volunteers, they are getting people ready to make phone calls, visit homes, or help with campaigns. It's about turning ideas into action. And finally, volunteer means to work without getting paid because you want to help others. Volunteers are the heart of any grassroots movement. They give their time and energy to support a cause they believe in. Without volunteers, most movements would not exist.
That's very clear, Julia. And I like how these words all connect with the idea of community power. Grassroots organizing sounds like a school for democracy. It teaches people how to lead, how to speak up, and how to work together.
Exactly, Adam. That's what makes it so educational, even for English learners. When you participate in a grassroots campaign, you don't just learn about politics, you learn communication skills, teamwork, and public speaking. You meet people from different backgrounds, practice your English, and share your stories. It's a living classroom for civic action.
That's such a great point, and I think that's one reason Zohran Mamdani's movement has grown so strong. It's built on connection. When people feel that someone truly listens to them, they get inspired to help and take part. That's the power of grassroots movements. They don't depend on one leader. They depend on thousands of ordinary people who decide to care.
Yes, Adam. And another important part of Mamdani's campaign is multilingual outreach. That means reaching out to people in many different languages. In New York, people speak Spanish, Bengali, Arabic, Chinese, and dozens of other languages. His team understands that to include everyone, you have to speak their language, literally and culturally. When volunteers call or visit people using the language they're most comfortable with, it builds trust and respect. It makes politics feel human again.
That's a beautiful example of inclusion, Julia. And it also shows how language learning connects with civic life. When people learn English or any language, they open the door to participation. They can express opinions, understand news, and communicate with neighbors. That's another reason why English learners listening to this podcast can relate to movements like Mamdani's. It's about giving people a voice.
Absolutely, Adam. And this is what I love most about his campaign. It shows that power doesn't just belong to politicians, it belongs to people who care enough to act. When ordinary citizens organize, mobilize, and volunteer, they can change their cities step by step. That's the message Zohran Mamdani sends to New Yorkers. And it's a message that can inspire people everywhere.
That's really inspiring, Julia. So, to sum it up, grassroots organizing is when regular people come together to solve problems in their own communities. They talk, plan, and act. They organize to bring structure, mobilize to take action, and volunteer to give their time freely. It's not about money or fame, it's about people helping people.
Exactly, Adam. And that's what makes it such a beautiful part of democracy. Whether it's helping a neighbor, joining a campaign, or simply learning how to speak about important issues in English, every small action counts. And for our listeners, remember that even learning the language of civic action is a step toward empowerment. When you can describe change, you can create it. As we continue exploring Zohran Mamdani's movement, it's important to understand how he positions himself in relation to traditional politics. In New York City, like in many big cities, there is a long history of established power. Politicians, wealthy donors, and influential business leaders who have shaped decisions for decades. Mamdani challenges what we often call the status quo, the way things have always been done. His campaign focuses on appealing to working-class voters, people who are often ignored by powerful elites. By giving ordinary citizens a voice, he is attempting to shift power away from a small group of decision-makers toward the broader community.
Julia, when we talk about power and established structures, our listeners might wonder, what kinds of power are we talking about here? Can you explain in simple terms?
Of course, Adam. In this context, power refers to the ability to make decisions that affect other people's lives. In cities like New York, power can appear in many forms. Political power means elected officials can pass laws and allocate money for services. Economic power means wealthy individuals or corporations can influence policies through donations or lobbying. Social power comes from networks, relationships, and influence over public opinion. Mamdani's movement questions how these powers have often prioritized the wealthy or elite, instead of addressing the everyday needs of working families.
That makes sense. So, who holds this power now, and why is Mamdani challenging it?
Right. Currently, power in New York politics is mostly held by long-established politicians, corporate donors, and elite interest groups. These groups tend to focus on maintaining the system that benefits them, often referred to as the establishment. They control resources, media attention, and access to decision-making. Mamdani challenges this by promoting a grassroots, people-first approach. He appeals directly to residents, tenants, small business owners, young workers, and immigrants, asking them to participate, speak up, and demand change. His campaign is designed to break the cycle where decisions are made only by those at the top.
Julia, for English learners, words like establishment, status quo, and challenge can be tricky. Could you give simple definitions and examples?
Absolutely, Adam. Let's start with establishment. The establishment refers to powerful people or groups who have traditionally controlled society, politics, or business. For example, when someone says, "The establishment resists change," it means powerful leaders or organizations don't want new ideas that could threaten their control. Next is status quo. This phrase describes the current situation or the way things are normally done. If Mamdani wants to challenge the status quo, it means he wants to change the usual way power works in the city. And finally, challenge means to question, oppose, or try to change something. In Mamdani's case, he is challenging established power structures by promoting fairness, equality, and grassroots involvement. That means he is not simply agreeing with the existing system. He is asking people to think differently and take action.
That's a clear explanation, Julia. So, in simple terms, Mamdani is standing up to powerful people who have controlled the city for a long time. He wants to give regular citizens more influence. That's a big part of why his movement has gained attention, because it speaks to fairness and opportunity for everyone.
Exactly, Adam. And this is where English learners can learn not just vocabulary, but also concepts that appear in news articles, debates, and civic discussions. Words like power, establishment, challenge, and status quo are abstract, but they become understandable when we connect them to real-life examples. Zohran Mamdani's story shows how these ideas are applied in practical politics, and by studying them, learners can discuss social change confidently in English.
Yes, Julia. And another important point is that challenging established power is not only about politics. It's also about society, culture, and the economy. When citizens begin to question who makes decisions and why, they learn to recognize inequality, injustice, and opportunities for improvement. This lesson is valuable for both English learning and global awareness.
Absolutely, Adam. Mamdani's campaign is a living example of people understanding power, questioning the status quo, and acting to make their communities better. And by learning the language of these concepts, our listeners can participate in discussions about leadership, fairness, and civic responsibility anywhere in the world.
So, to sum up, this section shows that power is not only about who has money or a title, it's about the ability to influence decisions and change systems. The establishment represents long-standing power. The status quo is how things usually work, and to challenge it means to question, oppose, and try to make things fairer. Zohran Mamdani's movement is a practical example of challenging power through grassroots action and community involvement.
Exactly, Adam. And for our listeners, understanding these words and ideas is important not only for English, but also for thinking critically about the world. This section gives us tools to describe political change, fairness, and community action clearly and accurately in English. And it reminds us that ordinary people, when they act together, can shift even long-established power structures. As we continue exploring Zohran Mamdani's story, it's important to understand how identity, diversity, and representation play a role in his movement. Mamdani is notable for being the first Muslim and the first South Asian American to run for a major political office in New York City. This is significant because it breaks historical patterns where only certain groups held visible power. Representation means that people from all backgrounds, religious, ethnic, and cultural, can see themselves in leadership roles. When citizens see leaders who share aspects of their identity, it can inspire them to participate in politics, feel included, and believe that their voices matter.
Julia, that's a fascinating point. For our English learners, why is representation important? Can you explain in simple words?
Of course, Adam. Representation means that a group of people is shown, included, or has a voice in decision-making. For example, if a school has students from many countries, it's important that teachers, programs, and activities reflect all these cultures. In politics, representation ensures that leaders understand the experiences of different communities. When Mamdani runs as the first Muslim and South Asian American candidate, it sends a message to young people and immigrants that they can be part of the political process. Representation gives people hope and encourages civic participation.
That makes sense. And identity seems to be central to his campaign. How does his personal background influence his political ideas?
Identity is very important, Adam. Mamdani grew up in a multicultural environment, and he has first-hand experience with issues faced by immigrants and minority communities. This perspective informs his policies, like advocating for affordable housing, equitable public services, and multilingual outreach. Because he understands the challenges different groups face, he can design solutions that include everyone. For English learners, this is a great example of how identity shapes not only personal experiences, but also the way we interact with society and politics.
Julia, could you explain why learning about identity and representation is useful for people learning English?
Absolutely. When learning English, understanding identity-related vocabulary helps learners communicate about culture, background, religion, and personal experiences. Words like diversity, representation, minority, and community are common in news, politics, and everyday conversations. For example, if someone asks you, "Why is diversity important in your city?" you can explain it using these words. Learning about Mamdani also shows learners that their own identities are valuable and that they can discuss complex social issues in English with confidence.
That's a great point. And it seems that diversity is not just about ethnicity or religion. It's also about perspectives and experiences. How does Mamdani's campaign reflect this broader meaning of diversity?
Exactly, Adam. Diversity includes language, culture, socio-economic status, age, and even personal experiences. Mamdani's campaign reaches people from many different backgrounds: immigrants, working-class families, students, and seniors. By including all these voices in his campaign, he is showing that politics should reflect the real population. This approach not only strengthens his movement, but also teaches us how to describe social differences and inclusion in English. Words like inclusive, community, and equity become easier to understand when connected to real-life examples.
So, in simple terms, Mamdani's candidacy teaches us that identity matters. Representation allows people to feel included and heard. And for English learners, this is a valuable lesson. You can talk about your background, diversity, and inclusion using new vocabulary, while also understanding how these ideas affect society.
Exactly, Adam. Seeing someone like Mamdani run for office inspires both citizens and learners. It reminds us that leadership is not limited to one group and that every voice counts. And from an English learning perspective, discussing identity and representation helps learners expand vocabulary, express opinions, and connect language with real-world social issues.
To sum it up, this section shows that identity, diversity, and representation are not just political terms. They are lived experiences. Learning the language to discuss these topics allows English learners to participate in conversations about fairness, inclusion, and community, while also understanding how these values shape leaders like Zohran Mamdani.
Exactly. And when learners can use words like representation, diversity, inclusive, and community correctly, they gain confidence to discuss social and political issues in English. Zohran Mamdani's story gives us both inspiration and practical vocabulary for understanding the role of identity in shaping change. As we continue examining Zohran Mamdani's movement, it's important to remember that no political campaign is without criticism. Every candidate, no matter how popular, faces questions, doubts, and disagreements. In Mamdani's case, some people wonder whether his proposals are feasible or possible to implement. Others debate the cost of policies like a rent freeze, city-run grocery stores, and free bus programs. There are also questions about how voters will react, whether the electorate is ready to support such change. Even his opponents, people who run against him, raise points to challenge his ideas. Understanding these debates is important for both voters and English learners because it teaches how to think critically and discuss different viewpoints in a fair and respectful way.
That's a great point, Julia. Could you explain what the main concerns about his campaign are? What do people worry about the most?
Absolutely, Adam. One major concern is feasibility, whether his proposals can realistically be implemented given the city's budget, bureaucracy, and existing laws. For example, a rent freeze or free bus service sounds attractive, but critics ask, where will the money come from? How will the city manage it? Another concern is the reaction of the electorate, the people who vote. Some voters may support his vision, while others worry that these ideas might be too radical or disrupt the current system. Finally, his opponents argue that focusing too much on affordability could neglect other important issues, like public safety or education. These are the kinds of debates that happen in any democracy, and learning the vocabulary around them helps learners discuss politics confidently in English.
I see. And you mentioned the word feasible. Could you explain that in simple words for our learners?
Of course, Adam. Feasible means something that is possible and practical to do. If a plan is feasible, it can actually happen in real life. For example, if someone proposes to build a park in a city lot, that's feasible if there is space, money, and approval from the city. But if someone proposes to build a park on a highway, that's not feasible. When people ask whether Mamdani's proposals are feasible, they are questioning whether these ideas can realistically be put into action.
That makes sense. And what about criticism and concern? How are these different, Julia?
Good question, Adam. Criticism is when someone expresses disagreement or disapproval of a person, idea, or plan. For example, a journalist might write a column criticizing a candidate's proposal for free buses, pointing out potential problems. Concern, on the other hand, is a worry or feeling that something might cause problems. For instance, citizens may have concerns about whether the city has enough money to pay for all these programs. Both words appear frequently in news and political discussions, so they're very useful for English learners.
And you also mentioned opponent. Could you clarify that one too?
Yes. An opponent is someone who disagrees with you or competes against you. In politics, opponents are usually other candidates running for the same office. They challenge your ideas, policies, and actions. Learning this word helps learners describe debates and elections in English. For example, Mamdani's opponents argue that some proposals may be too expensive.
Julia, this is really educational. It seems that understanding criticisms and risks is not just about politics, it's about learning how to look at both sides of any idea.
Exactly, Adam. For English learners, following debates, understanding vocabulary, like criticism, concern, feasible, and opponent, and seeing both sides of an argument improves both language skills and critical thinking. It teaches learners to read, listen, and discuss complex topics in English while expressing their own opinions respectfully.
So, to sum it up, every campaign faces questions, doubts, and debates. Critics highlight concerns, opponents challenge ideas, and voters ask whether plans are feasible. By learning these words and concepts, learners gain tools to talk about politics, plans, and social issues in English.
Exactly, Adam. And it also reminds our listeners that understanding different perspectives is key, not only in politics, but in everyday life. Learning the language of debate and criticism strengthens English skills and encourages thoughtful discussion.
Julia, as we've seen so far, New York City's affordability crisis affects millions of residents. But Zohran Mamdani doesn't just talk about the problems, he's built his campaign around solving them. His movement is not only about politics, but about economic justice, which means making sure everyone has access to fair wages, affordable housing, and essential services. Let's explore what this really means and how his ideas aim to make life better for ordinary New Yorkers.
That's a great starting point, Adam. Economic justice is a powerful phrase. It means building a system where resources and opportunities are shared more equally. In cities like New York, the gap between the rich and the poor is growing. On one side, you have luxury apartments, high-end restaurants, and billion-dollar corporations. On the other, you have working families struggling to pay rent, buy food, or afford health care. Mamdani's campaign tries to address this imbalance. He often says that New York should be a city for the many, not the few. His vision includes policies like a rent freeze, free public buses, higher minimum wages, and taxes on the wealthiest residents.
Julia, could you explain that phrase, for the many, not the few? It sounds simple but carries a lot of meaning.
Of course. The phrase for the many, not the few, means that society should work to benefit everyone, not just a small group of rich or powerful people. In this context, Mamdani wants the city's resources, like housing, transportation, and education, to serve all citizens, not just those who can afford to live comfortably. It's a phrase that captures the spirit of equality and fairness, which are central ideas in his campaign.
That makes sense. Let's talk more about how these policies connect to everyday life. For example, what does it mean to have free public buses?
That's a great question, Adam. Free public buses mean that anyone can ride city buses without paying a fare. It may sound like a small change, but for low-income families, it can make a big difference. Imagine a worker who takes 2 buses to work every day. That could cost several dollars each trip, adding up to hundreds of dollars a month. Making buses free helps reduce financial pressure on families and encourages more people to use public transport instead of cars, which also helps the environment. Mamdani's idea was to test this through a pilot program, a temporary experiment, to see how it works before expanding it citywide.
That's really interesting, Julia. And what about his proposal for city-run grocery stores? That sounds unusual.
It is, and it's one of his most creative ideas. In many parts of New York, especially low-income areas, There are what we call food deserts. That means neighborhoods where people have limited access to affordable and healthy food. There might be plenty of fast food places or small corner shops, but few supermarkets with fresh produce. Mamdani's idea is to create city-run grocery stores that offer healthy food at fair prices. These stores wouldn't aim to make profit. Instead, they'd serve the community. This helps families save money and improves overall health. It also provides jobs for local residents, creating a cycle of community benefit.
That's a really smart approach. I can see how these ideas connect to each other. Housing, transportation, food, wages, they're all parts of the same problem. When one thing becomes expensive, it affects everything else.
Exactly, Adam. That's what economists call interconnected systems. When rent rises, people have less money for food or transport. When transportation is expensive, it's harder to reach good jobs. Mamdani's movement tries to look at the big picture instead of solving just one problem. It's about how all these systems work together. His slogan could almost be, "You can't fix housing without fixing income. You can't fix income without fixing transit."
That's a very holistic way to think about change. Julia, for our English learners, could you explain the word holistic?
Sure, Adam. Holistic means looking at something as a whole, rather than just focusing on one part. For example, if you want to improve your English holistically, you don't only study grammar, you also practice speaking, listening, and reading. Similarly, Mamdani looks at social problems holistically. He doesn't just focus on housing or transport alone, but sees how everything connects.
I like that example. It really makes the meaning clear. And Julia, one of the words you used earlier was economic justice. Could we explain that again in simple words?
Definitely. Economic justice means fairness in how money, jobs, and opportunities are distributed. It's the idea that everyone should have what they need to live with dignity. For example, if a city's economy grows, the benefits should reach workers, not only business owners or investors. Economic justice tries to close the gap between rich and poor.
So, in a way, Mamdani's campaign is not only political, it's educational too. It teaches people how the economy works and why these issues matter.
Exactly, Adam. He often talks about empowerment, another useful word for our learners. Empowerment means giving people the confidence, knowledge, and ability to take control of their lives. For example, if tenants understand their rights, they can speak up against unfair rent increases. If workers understand how wages are set, they can demand fair pay. Learning English can also be empowering because it gives learners access to more information and the ability to express their ideas on global platforms.
That's such a good point. And I think that's what makes this podcast so meaningful. We're not just learning English, we're learning how language connects to real life. Julia, one thing I find interesting about Mamdani's campaign is how he uses simple, clear language when speaking about complex topics. That's something our listeners can learn from too.
Yes, Adam. It's a very good communication skill. When he talks about policies like rent freezes or public transit, he doesn't use difficult terms or long explanations. He speaks directly to the people. This helps him build trust. And it also shows that powerful ideas don't need complicated words. For English learners, that's a great reminder. Clarity is stronger than complexity.
That's so true. And I think the emotional side of his campaign also plays a big role. People feel heard and included when someone speaks their language, literally and emotionally.
Absolutely, Adam. Mamdani's team does multilingual outreach, which means they communicate with residents in different languages spoken in Queens, Spanish, Bengali, Urdu, and many others. This makes people feel represented and valued. It's another form of inclusivity and empowerment. When people understand the message, they feel part of the movement. For English learners, it's also a reminder that language is power. It connects people, builds trust, and creates change.
Julia, that's such a powerful connection. So, to sum up, Mamdani's vision for economic justice is about more than just money. It's about fairness, opportunity, and dignity. His movement connects housing, wages, transportation, and food into one bigger picture. And through simple, inclusive communication, he inspires people to believe that change is possible.
Exactly, Adam. His story shows that when people come together and understand their rights, they can transform their city. And for English learners, this conversation shows that vocabulary is not just about learning new words. It's about learning how those words describe real experiences. So when you learn terms like economic justice, empowerment, holistic, or interconnected, you're not just improving your English, you're learning to think critically about society.
That's beautifully said, Julia. And to our listeners, as you practice your English, try using these new words in your conversations. For example, you might say, economic justice means fairness for all workers, or the housing crisis and transportation problems are interconnected. Speaking like this helps you use English naturally and confidently.
Exactly, Adam. And remember, behind every big idea, like Mamdani's fight for economic justice, there are people with real stories, dreams, and struggles. When you learn the language of change, you become part of a global conversation. You learn not just how to speak English, but how to speak about the world.
Beautifully put, Julia. That's what the English Globe is all about, helping learners build language and awareness together.
Yes, Adam. And in that way, learning English becomes more than a skill. It becomes a way to understand fairness, empathy, and the hope for a better future. As we reach the end of our discussion about Zohran Mamdani's movement, let's take a moment to summarize the key takeaways. First, his campaign shows how one person can challenge established power structures through grassroots organizing, community involvement, and inclusive policies. Second, it highlights the importance of identity, diversity, and representation, showing that leadership can reflect the people it serves. Third, it reminds us that all proposals come with criticism and debate, and understanding different perspectives is essential. For English learners, this story offers valuable vocabulary, words like affordability, grassroots, representation, feasible, opponent, and status quo, and teaches how to use them in context while discussing real-world issues.
Julia, I think that's a very thorough summary. Before we close, I'd like to ask our listeners a reflective question. What will you remember from this story? Which part inspired you, and how might you use these ideas or vocabulary in your own life or English learning journey? Thinking about this can help you connect language to action and deepen your understanding of both politics and communication.
Exactly, Adam. Reflection is a powerful tool for learning. By thinking critically about what we've discussed, learners can not only remember vocabulary and concepts, but also understand how these ideas apply in everyday life. Perhaps you'll be inspired to explore more about grassroots movements, political campaigns, or community activism in your own city. Maybe you'll notice how representation and identity influence leadership where you live. And you can practice discussing these topics in English with friends, teachers, or online communities, using the new vocabulary and phrases we've shared today.
Yes, Julia. And for English learners, connecting language with meaningful topics makes learning more memorable and engaging. When we discuss real-life stories like Mamdani's, words become tools to understand society, communicate ideas, and think critically.
So, dear listeners, as you reflect on this story, consider the power of ordinary people to create change, the importance of fair representation, and the way debate shapes decisions. Remember the vocabulary we've explored, and try to use it in your own conversations or writing. By combining language learning with curiosity about the world, you're building skills that go far beyond grammar or memorization.
Exactly, Julia. Zohran Mamdani's movement teaches us lessons about fairness, community, and action. And it also reminds us that learning a language is not just about words, it's about ideas, understanding, and participation. So take a moment now to think, which part of this story will stay with you? And how can you use it to improve your English and your understanding of the world?
That's right, Adam. And to all our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and remember that learning English can open doors to new ideas and global conversations. This story is just one example of how language connects us to the world around us. By reflecting, discussing, and researching further, you continue growing both as a learner and as a thoughtful global citizen.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you to our listeners for joining us today. Remember, every word you learn, every idea you explore, and every question you ask brings you closer to understanding English and the world it describes.
Exactly, Adam. So keep listening, keep learning, and keep reflecting. And remember, your voice matters, just like the voices in Zohran Mamdani's movement. Use what you've learned today to think, speak, and act confidently in English and in life.